The first thing I noticed, waking, was the smell of hot iron and pine pitch, and how strange it was to notice a smell at all instead of the cold that had been the only thing in the world for 6 days straight. There was a stove not 4 feet from where I lay, ticking the way a stove ticks when it's been fed well and left to work, and the light off its little grate was orange and low and steady. And somewhere above us, I could hear it without seeing it. The wind was still going, still throwing itself at the mountain the way it had been throwing itself at us, except now there was 60 feet of good rock between it and me, and a door of packed snow sealing the rest. My brother was asleep on the other bunk, which was its own kind of miracle, because Zeke didn't sleep easy, even in a boarding house bed with money paid ahead. He had one arm hanging off the edge of the bunk, and his hat over his face, and his boots still on, and I remember thinking, before anything else, that he looked younger like that. Younger than 22. Younger than I'd seen him look since before we left Kentucky. 6 days before this, we should have been dead. I want to say that plain, because it's the truest thing in this whole story, and everything else only makes sense once you've got that fact sitting in your chest. 2 boys, a shared rifle, 38 pounds of food and gear, split between 2 packs, $14.60 in coin, and a blanket each. That was what we had against the Elk Range in the second week of November, 1878, at 10,400 feet of elevation, where the summer doesn't so much end as get chased off the mountain by something meaner. We hadn't planned on dying. Nobody plans on it. We'd planned on crossing a pass before the snow closed it, and the mountain had other ideas. And for the better part of a week, I'd stopped being able to feel my own feet and started wondering, in a calm sort of way that scared me more than panic would have, whether that was how it started. The calm. But I woke up warm. I woke up with lantern light and a stove and my brother breathing slow beside me, and somewhere close by, though I hadn't looked yet, there was a smell of old dust and older paper, like a trunk that's been shut a long time. I want to tell you how we got there, into that mountain, into that particular hollowed-out dark that turned out to be warmer and kinder than any cabin we'd ever slept in, mine or a stranger's. It didn't start with the storm. It started 4 days before the storm ever caught us, with a decision my brother made at a fork in a trail that I argued against at the time, and have never once been sorry he made since. 4 days before, we were still counting our money, like it mattered how we spent it, like the mountain cared one way or another whether we'd saved a dime on flour at Alder Creek or paid full price. $14.60 between us, and I know the figure exact because Zeke made me recite it every morning like a prayer, the way some men say grace. $14.60, 38 pounds of goods split 2 ways, 1 rifle, 1 axe, 2 blankets that had stopped being wool-colored sometime around Nebraska and gone the gray of everything we owned. We were headed for the pass because the map we'd bought off a freighter in Leadville, a bad map we'd learn, drawn by a man who'd never walked it himself, showed a trail through the Elk Range that would save us 9 days over going around by the wagon road. Tuesday morning, the sky was the color of a bruise healing, that yellow-green a sky gets before it decides to hurt you. I noticed it. I didn't say anything, because at 17, you learn there's a difference between noticing a thing and being the one who says it out loud. And saying it out loud means you're the one who has to be right about it later. Zeke noticed it too. I could tell by the way he kept looking up between checking the pack straps, the way his mouth got flatter. We'd come to a fork by mid-morning, one trail dropping south along a creek that the freighter's map didn't even show, the other climbing straight on toward the pass, toward the plan, toward the 9 days we'd already spent in our heads. I wanted to keep to the plan. I said so. I said the temperature was just autumn, doing what autumn does at 10,000 feet. And Zeke didn't answer me for a while, just stood there, with his hand flat against the bark of a lodgepole pine, like he was taking its pulse. Then he said we were dropping down along the creek instead, following it wherever it went, because a creek always goes somewhere a man's been before, and a pass on a bad map might not. I argued. I want that on the record, wherever this kind of thing gets recorded. I argued we were burning daylight, burning miles, and for what? A hunch about weather that hadn't even started yet. He didn't argue back. That was always his way, not answering the argument, just walking, so that eventually you either followed him or you were standing alone on a mountain, and I was 17, not stupid. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped maybe 15 degrees, sharp enough that my breath started hanging in front of my face, like something I could reach out and touch, and the light had gone that pale, flat color that isn't quite winter yet, but knows it's coming, and knows exactly how far off it is. We'd been 3 years on the road by then, since our father walked off from the place in Kentucky and didn't come back. And in 3 years, you learn a rhythm, the way you learn a hymn, you've sung too many times to remember learning it. Zeke carried the rifle, and I carried the axe, because he said a man thinks clearer with a long gun on his shoulder, and I was still growing into my hands. We split the pack weight, so neither of us favored a hip by the second week of any stretch. 19 pounds on my back, 19 on his, give or take what we ate or traded away. We knew how to read a camp before we made one, how to strike a fire with damp tinder if you shave it thin enough, how to walk 12 miles on a strip of jerky and not complain where the other one could hear it. That was the rule, mostly unspoken. You didn't complain where he could hear it. That afternoon, the creek Zeke had chosen kept to its business, dropping through stands of spruce so thick the light came down in coins instead of sheets, and the sound of the water was the only steady thing in a day that felt like it was holding its breath. I remember the smell of it, cold stone and wet bark, and somewhere under that, the mineral smell that meant we were still high, still far from anywhere a man had built a fence. My hands had gone stiff enough that I'd stopped feeling the axe handle as a separate thing from my fingers. Zeke noticed. He always noticed before I said anything, which used to needle me when I was younger, and wanted credit for my own suffering, and by 17, I'd learned to be grateful for it instead. The wind came first, not the snow, a wind that dropped down off some ridge we couldn't see, and moved through the spruce like it was looking for something it had lost. Then the sky, which had been the color of a coin all afternoon, went the color of a bruise, and Zeke stopped walking and looked up in a way that told me everything before he said a word. We found a shelf of rock and got the tarp half up before the snow hit, and when it hit like a door slamming. Not flakes drifting down pretty the way they do in a boy's storybook, but snow coming sideways, hard, driven, so that within 10 minutes I couldn't see the creek that had been not 30 feet from us, couldn't see the trees we'd been standing under, couldn't see Zeke's outstretched arm past his own elbow. The whole world had closed down to the length of my own hand, and somewhere out past that white nothing, the mountain went on being exactly as old and exactly as indifferent as it had always been, storm or no storm, brothers or no brothers, whether we found our way through it or simply became one more thing it kept. I want to say we decided things calmly, the way men do in stories told years later by a fire. But the truth of it is smaller and uglier than that. The truth is I was crying without much noise about it. The kind of crying that isn't sadness so much as your body deciding on its own that the cold has gone past what it's built to argue with. And Zeke had a hold of the back of my coat collar, the way you'd grab a dog that was fixing to bolt into traffic. Not out of anger, but because letting go felt like the one thing he wasn't willing to do. I'd seen it maybe 20 minutes before the sky turned, a dark seam low in the rock, off to our right and down slope, not 50 yards from the game trail we'd been following. I almost hadn't said anything. It looked like nothing, a shadow, a fold in the stone, the kind of thing the mountains are full of, and which usually amounts to exactly nothing when a man goes to the trouble of climbing down to it. I remember thinking it wasn't worth the breath to mention, that we needed to keep moving toward the pass, while there was still a pass to move toward. But I said it anyway. The way you say a thing you don't quite believe matters. and Zeke had turned his head toward where I was pointing, before the words were even all the way out of my mouth. Now, with the world gone the color and texture of a scoured pot, he shouted something at me that the wind tore most of the shape off of, and grabbed my collar, and turned me bodily downhill in the direction of that seam like a man setting a compass. I want to tell you, he weighed it out, considered the trail, considered the shelf of rock we'd half sheltered under, considered our chances against the 50 yards of blind snow between us and a shadow that might be nothing at all. I don't think there was time for weighing. I think 17 years of watching that man make decisions had taught me that when Zeke's jaw set like that, and his hand found my collar, the deciding was already finished, had maybe finished itself somewhere below the part of him that used words. We went half crouched, half crawling, the tarp abandoned behind us in a heap neither of us would ever see again, the sharps banging against my brother's spine with every stumbling step, my own pack dragging my shoulders back, like something trying to hold me in the storm on purpose. The snow had teeth in it. I could not feel my own face. Twice I went down on the rock, and twice Zeke's hand found some part of me before I'd finished falling, and the whole time, some small, clear voice in me, very calm, very separate from the rest of it, kept saying, "It was there, it was there, don't lose it now." The shadow turned out to be a door, not a cave mouth, not a shelf of rock leaning right to fool a desperate eye, but timber, real cut timber, gray with age, set into the hillside like someone had meant it to last. I did not understand this at first. My mind had gone narrow and stupid with cold, down to a single purpose, the way a hand will forget every finger but the one that's caught in something. Zeke hit the door with his shoulder once, twice, and on the third time it gave with a crack of old wood and a puff of air that smelled of nothing at all. No smoke, no rot, just cold stone and stillness, which after 2 hours in that wind felt like the inside of a church. There was a lintel above the doorframe, hand-hewed, and someone had taken a knife to it a long time back. The light was going fast, the gray kind of dying that doesn't so much fade as get swallowed, but I saw it plain enough before we ducked under. D. Ashford, 1839. I did not think about what it meant. I did not think about anything, except that my brother's hand was still in my collar, and he was hauling me through the gap and into the dark beyond it. We went in on our hands and knees at first, then stumbling upright as the passage widened, the storm's roar dropping behind us like a door closing on a loud room. 30 feet, 40, the walls close and dry, and smelling of old dust, and something else underneath it I couldn't name yet. 60 feet in, near as I'd later pace it out, the tunnel opened into a room cut square and honest, and Zeke's hand found flint before I even understood there was something to strike it against. The light showed us a stove, cast iron, squat, black, a pipe running up through a chimney someone had bored clean through solid rock above it. 2 bunks built into the wall, plank and peg, blankets folded on each one, gray with dust but whole. I stood there dripping and shaking and staring like a fool at furniture, at a room, at a life someone had built 40 feet under a mountain, and 40 years before either of us was a thought in our mother's head. Zeke didn't stare. Zeke already had the stove door open, was already checking the flue with fingers too numb to feel if it drew right, was already a man doing the next necessary thing instead of marveling at the last impossible one. That was always the difference between us. I noticed. He acted. Outside, not 50 feet away, the storm was killing anything left in it. The tinder Zeke found sat in a tin box on the second shelf, dry as October leaves, and I remember thinking a man does not leave dry tinder in a tin box unless he means to come back to it, or unless someone else means to find it and live. He struck twice before it caught. The third strike held, and the little curl of flame he fed with shavings off an old crate slat felt like the first true thing that had happened to us in 9 hours. I fed it too slow at first, the way you do when you've been that cold. like the fire might be offended by too much wood too fast. Zeke elbowed me aside and built it right. Log cabin style, patient and inside 20 minutes. That iron stove was ticking and popping and throwing heat into a room that had held nothing but stone-cold silence for longer than either of us had been alive. We ate that night off what we'd carried in. 4 ounces of jerked beef apiece, a fist of hardtack split between us, nothing more. Because 38 pounds of supplies has to last a long way past one storm, and neither of us knew yet how long the pass would stay shut. Zeke portioned it out without a word, the way he always did, like the math was a thing he carried in his hands instead of his head. I chewed slow to make it last, and looked around that room by firelight, and that's when I started noticing what didn't sit right, though it took me a while to say why. The floor was swept. Not dusty like a floor 40 years abandoned ought to be, but scraped bare down to the stone in a pattern, like someone had worked a broom or a bough, back and forth in long strokes, more than once in his life. There were shelves mounted into the rock wall opposite the bunks, pegged and leveled, holding tin cups set upside down in a neat row, a shaving mirror gone black with age, a comb. Not the shelves of a man just keeping his tools dry, the shelves of a man keeping house. I said as much to Zeke, low, not sure why I was whispering 40 feet under a mountain with a storm roaring outside that would have drowned a shout. He didn't answer right off. He was looking at the same shelves I was, at the same swept floor, turning something over the way he does before he lets it out of his mouth. Man built this for more than himself, he said finally. I asked him what he meant, though some part of me already knew. The way you know a house has a woman in it before you see her. From the curtains, from the smell of bread, instead of just wood smoke. Zeke didn't answer that either. He just looked toward the back of that square-cut room, past the bunks, to where the firelight didn't quite reach, and I followed his eyes and saw the corner of something wooden and deliberate sitting there in the dark, waiting on us, like it had been waiting on somebody for 40 years. We crossed to it together, careful, the way you'd cross a room where somebody might be sleeping. It was a box, sure enough, maybe 2 foot by 3, made of good pine, dovetailed at the corners by a man who knew what he was doing with a saw, not nailed shut, sealed with a wooden latch and a strip of leather gone stiff as bark. Zeke worked it loose with his knife, while I held the lamp close, and the smell that came up out of that box when he finally got the lid free was the strangest thing I ever breathed underground. Tallow and cedar and something sweeter under it, like dried apple, 40 years old and still holding its ghost of a smell. Inside, packed tight in oiled cloth, we found tins of preserved goods gone to rust at the seams but whole, a coil of good rope, a folding knife, a spool of thread, and 3 needles stuck through a scrap of wool, a small mirror smaller than the one on the shelf, and under all of it, wrapped separate in its own cloth like it mattered more than the rest put together, a leather-bound journal and a folded letter, sealed, the paper gone the color of weak tea. Zeke didn't open the letter. He turned it over once in his hands and set it down like it was hot, and I understood that even then, even bone-tired and half-frozen still in our fingers, he knew that letter wasn't ours to read yet, maybe not ever. But the journal he opened, and I leaned in over his shoulder, and by lamplight that flickered every time the wind found some crack 40 feet above us, we started reading the handwriting of a man named David Ashford, careful schoolteacher letters, dated far back as 1839, the same year cut into that timber at the door. He wrote about the shaft, the color he was chasing, the cold, but near every page, sometimes just a line at the bottom, sometimes half the entry, he wrote about a woman, Margaret. Margaret would want the floor swept. Margaret would need a proper stove, not just a fire ring. Margaret's hands were made for a garden, not a mine camp, so he'd have to make enough first, enough to bring her somewhere better than this. But he built the somewhere better right here, plank by plank, year on year, like a man laying a table for a guest he was certain was coming. I looked at the bunks, then different than I had an hour before. Two of them, built wide enough, set close enough together that a man building for himself alone wouldn't have bothered. He was building her a house, I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to, down there in that dugout dark, one board at a time, for years. Zeke didn't say anything. He just turned the page, and the wind found the crack again, and the lamp guttered, and outside the mountain kept doing what it had been doing to men like us for 40 years and more. We went through the pages slower after that. The two of us hunched close over the lamp, so our shadows made one shape on the wall. And the entries kept coming, the way a man's thoughts come when he's got nobody else to tell them to. April of 1845, he'd built a chair, not bought, not scavenged, built, from a blow-down spruce he'd hauled down off the ridge with a rope over his shoulder, and he wrote 3 lines about the joinery like it was scripture, how he'd cut the mortise clean so it wouldn't wobble when she sat in it come evening. June, he'd hung a mirror he'd carried up from Alder Creek wrapped in a flour sack, and he wrote that he hoped she wouldn't mind it was small, that a woman ought to have something to see herself in besides creek water. I read that one twice. Zeke didn't say anything, but he'd gone still in that particular way he had, the way that meant he was feeling something and wasn't going to let it show on his face. By the winter of 1846, the second bunk was framed and filled with a tick he'd stuffed himself. Dried grass and something softer under it he didn't name, and he'd built a shelf above it, just her height, he guessed, though he admitted in the margin he was only guessing, since it had been years since he'd stood close enough to a woman to measure one against himself. There was a letter folded into the back pages, the ink gone brown, the fold worn soft as cloth. Zeke didn't open it. I wanted to and didn't say so. The entries kept coming through that autumn, shorter now, more practical. The game was scarce. The shaft was flooding at 40 feet, and he'd need to shore it before he could go deeper. He was low on powder, and would have to make the walk to Alder Creek before the passes shut. Then December, then a date in January of 1847, and half a page about the cold, about a trapline he meant to check up the side draw before the snow got too deep to manage it, about how he figured 3 more good seasons of pay dirt, and he'd have enough, finally enough, to send the letter and mean it. And then the sentence just stopped. Not a period, not a closed thought. The pen had come down mid-word, a smear where the ink had dragged, like something had called him up and away from the table before he'd finished the line, and he'd meant to come back to it, the way a man leaves a fire not out, but banked, expecting to return before it dies. There was nothing after. No entry in February, no spring. The rest of the journal was blank pages, 40 of them at least, waiting the way the second bunk was waiting, the way the chair by the cold stove was waiting. I looked up at Zeke. "That's it," I said. "That's all there is." He closed the cover slow, like it was something that might still wake up if he let it, and set it on his knee, and for a long while, neither one of us said a thing, and the wind kept working at that crack in the door, like it wanted in on whatever we'd just found. It was 3 days on before we found the tunnel, and only because the wind finally let up enough to let us go looking. We'd noticed it the first night, really, a second dark mouth in the rock, about 40 feet past the main adit, half choked with old snow, and a fall of rubble that had come down sometime long before we ever climbed up onto Squaw Fork. Zeke had said leave it, and I had left it, because there was wood to split and a stove to learn, and no sense chasing shadows when the pass was still murder outside the door. But the journal sat different in me after that last entry. A man doesn't stop mid-word unless something stops him. So on the 4th morning, with the sky gone that hard flat blue that means the storm spent itself for a while, we took the Collins axe and a length of rope and dug. It didn't take long. The rockfall was old but not deep, more a slide of loose shale than a true collapse, and behind it, the tunnel ran maybe 20 feet before the roof had come down proper and sealed it for good. In that 20 feet, we found what was left of a trapline check that never finished, a rusted jaw trap, sprung and empty, chain still pegged into a crack in the wall, and scattered along the tunnel floor the bones of an elk, or what had been an elk once, gnawed thin by whatever came down after the man who set that trap stopped coming. Zeke crouched and turned the trap over with the axe head, careful, like it might still bite. He was checking lines, he said. In the winter, alone. I didn't say anything. I was looking at how close it was to the shelter, no more than 60 paces from where the stove stood banked and waiting all these years, and thinking how a man could walk 60 paces in a whiteout and never find his own door again, how the mountain didn't need to take him far, just far enough that the wind covered his tracks before he thought to be afraid. He wasn't hunting supper, I said finally. He had a season's worth of jerky in that cache already. Zeke looked at me. He was checking to see if the trapline was still worth running, I said. 3 more seasons, he wrote. He was still counting. The wind picked up again outside, soft this time, working at the crack in the door the way it always did, patient as anything, and I thought about a man out there in that same sound, listening to it, still waiting on an answer that had already stopped coming and just hadn't reached him yet. We waited 11 days before the sky gave us a window worth trusting. Zeke said we'd know it when the smoke off the stovepipe started standing straight up instead of getting torn sideways off the roof, and on the 12th morning, that's exactly what it did, and we packed a day's food and left the rest banked and locked, and walked the 2 days down to Alder Creek, with the snow crusted hard enough to hold our weight if we stepped careful. The trading post smelled like coffee and wet dog and lamp oil. The postmaster was a heavy man named Purcell, who kept his ledgers stacked on a shelf behind a counter, worn smooth as river stone, and when Zeke asked him about a Margaret Teal, he didn't even reach for a book at first. He just looked at us like we'd asked him something out of an old dream he'd had once and set aside. Then he did reach for the book. 1846, he said, turning pages with a thumb gone yellow at the nail. Independence, Missouri. He found the entry and turned the ledger around so we could read it ourselves, like he didn't trust his own memory to carry the weight of it out loud. Fever, it said. Autumn of that year. A wagon company that never left, because half of it got sick first, and she was one of the names on the list that didn't get better. I did the arithmetic before Zeke said it, though he said it anyway, quiet, like he was checking his own sum against mine. Ashford's journal ran to the winter of 1847, a year after. More than a year. He'd written her name in that cash list in March of 47. 3 jars for Margaret, saved back. He didn't know. He couldn't have known. Not up here. Not with no rider coming through that far and that late in the season. And I thought about him writing 3 more seasons in his own hand, still counting, and it wasn't the trapline he'd been counting after all, or it was, but only because the trapline was the only clock he had, and he'd been keeping time against a woman already a year in the ground. Purcell asked if we knew the man, and Zeke said we'd found where he lived, and left it at that. Purcell didn't push. Men who lived up in that country and didn't come down were their own kind of common, and I could see him deciding not to ask which kind this one had turned out to be. We bought matches and coffee and a little sugar with the last of our coin, and started back up before noon, and neither one of us said much on the walk, the snow squeaking under our boots the whole way, and all I could think was that somewhere below all that ice was a claim marker he'd probably meant to move, once he had someone worth building the rest of the cabin for. We got back to the adit a little after 2, the light already going flat and blue the way it does early in that country come November. And Zeke set the coffee and matches on the shelf like they were fragile, like they might crack if he set them down too hard. Neither one of us said anything for a while. I built the fire up bigger than it needed to be, and Zeke sat on the near bunk with his elbows on his knees and looked at the stove like it owed him an answer. I kept thinking about the ledger. 3 more winters counted after she was already gone. A man writing lines by lamplight about traps and snowfall and the price of flour, not knowing he was keeping a calendar for a grave he'd never stood over. And I thought about Pa, and I didn't want to, but it came anyway, the way it always does when you let your mind go loose in the cold. 9 years old, watching him ride off from the Kentucky place saying he'd send word once he was settled, and 11 years of no word, and Zeke 14, and telling me not to ask Ma about it anymore, because it only made her cry. We never found where Pa's bones were, if he had bones to be found. We never got a ledger, never got a name in a book at some trading post to tell us the shape of it. Just the not knowing, going on and on, the way Ashford's must have gone on, except his had an ending, even if it was a hard one, even if it came too late for him to do anything but keep counting. I said, he never got to know. Zeke didn't ask what I meant. He just nodded, slow, looking at the fire. Man built bunks for two, I said. Built a cache big enough to keep somebody through winters she was never going to see. Kept building it right up to the end, like the building was the same thing as believing. Maybe it was, Zeke said. We sat with that a while, the fire popping, the wind starting up outside again, softer than before, more like breath than blizzard. And I think it was somewhere in that quiet that we both came to the same decision, without saying it plain, that we weren't going to just winter here and move on come spring, the way we'd wintered in a dozen other places, taking only what we needed and leaving the rest to rot. This place had been built for someone. It seemed a poor thing to let it fall down around nobody at all. We ought to fix the roof proper, Zeke said, not just patch it. Stove needs a new door latch too, I said. And them bunks could use resetting, the way that one leg's gone soft. Zeke looked at me, and something in his face had eased some since the trading post, like deciding to work on something was its own kind of answer. So we worked through the rest of that winter and into the thin edge of spring, and I won't pretend it was fast. Zeke reset the bunk leg with a wedge cut from a pine round, and I spent the better part of 2 days on the stove door, filing down a new latch from a strap of iron we'd carried since Fairplay, until it closed with a sound like something satisfied. We hauled fresh timber up from the tree line for the roof, notched it the way the old joints had been notched, so it would sit true against wood 40 years settled. The snow let up by the second week of March, and by April, the ground on the south-facing slope had gone soft and dark, and we knew the pass would be walkable inside a month. We restocked the cache ourselves before we left it. Dried meat, a paper of matches wrapped in oilcloth, a spare awl, a tin of salt, things we could spare from what little we had, because we understood by then what the box was for, not for us. For whoever came through starving and half frozen the way we had, some year we'd never see. On the last morning, Zeke took the knife and worked at the lintel a long while, quiet, and when he stepped back, there were 2 lines cut into the wood instead of 1. D. Ashford, 1839, and under it, smaller, plainer, M. Teal. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did I. We just shouldered the packs and started down toward the fork, the mine going dark and small behind us, the way places do once you've turned your back. I've thought on it plenty of times since, walking on toward wherever the next range put us. A man can build a whole life waiting on someone who's never coming, and it doesn't make him foolish, not the way I first thought. It makes him faithful, which is a rarer thing, and maybe the only thing worth remembering a person by. Our own father never built anything for anybody. He just walked off one morning and let the country have him, and for years I held that against the whole idea of waiting, like it was proof the waiting never means anything. But that mine taught me different. A shelter isn't 4 walls and a roof. It's who you keep the fire going for, whether or not they ever walk through the door. If you've got a brother, or someone you'd build a stove for in the dead of winter without being asked twice, tell us about them below. And if you want to keep walking these mountains with us, stay close. There's more country ahead, and more names carved into old wood waiting to be found.